And now we're going to jump into our second lightning round. One of my favorite parts of this is getting to know Matt, the Web3 Club president here at DU, an undergraduate student. And Lindsay and I were joking, we could hear Matt talk about this work for hours, because in our first meeting, he was just having so much knowledge around this that we were writing notes furiously. So with that, I'll introduce Matt Romo Nichols for his conversation around Web3 and the future of the university student experience at DU.
How's it going, guys? Good. Anyway, nice to meet you all. Thank you all for coming out today. My name is Matthew Romo Nichols. I'm the current president for the Web3 Club at the University of Denver. We founded the Web3 Club last year with Jeremy Osborne and Peter White. They've now graduated and moved on to other endeavors. Essentially with the whole idea in providing an educational playground for students to interact safely with Web3 and blockchain protocols and find out the real world implications in terms of their utility and potential applications in the future. Going a bit further, guys, my individual talk today is to be focusing on blockchain and the future university experience and how these technologies can change how we interact as an individual student, as conglomerates, and as clubs with different events and, how would you say it? Other Web3 protocols that are going to continue to gain mass adoption in the near future. Going a bit further, guys, I mean, I know Professor Charles touched on this topic in terms of like what is a blockchain and understanding the key features and functionality that students can benefit from. Honestly, Professor Charles did everything, so we don't need to touch this on the slide. It's more the last bit that I'm going to focus on right here in terms of the student benefit is the pseudo-anonymous identities that are associated with your on-chain profile. And that's going to be a huge benefit for students to be able to do essentially freely participate in these Web3 protocols without compromising on their underlying validity or personal identity as a student and compromising their own personal information. Want to dive into a little bit more is breaking down the barriers and understanding the decentralized learning environments associated with Web3. So one of the key things that Web3 will provide future university students, educators, as well as educational institutions is the accessibility to global educational resources. Currently, from a graduate perspective, obtaining financing and research funding for a theoretical research grant is extremely, it's a centralized process in that you're having to source through like an individual faculty program, or you're having to work with a university, a group of individuals in terms of vetting the individual research process. And it could be subjected to discriminatory efforts as a result of race, bias, sexual orientation, the underlying validity or description of the project that's being proposed. And the idea is that through having a decentralized learning environment, such as an education-based DAO or different Web3 protocols that are put on by universities, we're able to decentralize the ability to garner and vet research projects on a university level. But one thing that's really important to note, guys, is that through these education-based DAOs, university students are able to have access to open platforms for sharing their knowledge and expertise on the subject matter. So essentially, instead of having an individual student ID, such as Matthew Romo Nichols or Avery Hughes or any arbitrary individual in the audience, like tied to a particular research idea proposal, essentially your individual identity could be tied to a hash, as Professor Charles was saying. And essentially that hash has no identifying features of that student, their undergraduate or graduate classification status, their major, potential other underlying characteristics that could deter that particular group from obtaining funding in the future. So the one thing we try to really focus is the role of the information gatekeeper within academia, in that historically it obviously evolved from the church to the government to mainstream media sources in terms of how is the general public able to access this transactional information on a day-to-day basis. So what we really try to do here is through these educational DAOs and through decentralizing the education process on a university level, we are able to essentially democratize and remove the influence of information gatekeepers within society. And that's really an important thing, is that information and education is awesome. I mean, you're going to be learning about things all day, every day, and I don't think it should be subjected to an individual country or ideology that has access to that information. So one thing that's really interesting is that once, again, a lot of these ideas of academic-based DAOs and decentralized learning environments are purely conceptual right now. However, in theory, many of these learning environments will be interoperable in that we could have a University of Denver-based DAO that allows for individual research projects that start in the University of Denver and allow for cross-institutional collaboration with other Colorado universities, national universities, and international institutions that individuals can take advantage of. One thing that we wanted to talk about here is, or a potential use case that I've actually loved and we've actually dived into in the last 3 or 4 months, is pertaining to blockchain-based academic records. So one thing here, and I think this is coming off Professor Charles and Professor Coleman's talk, is the use of NFTs and digital credentials in verifying student experiences that will occur in the coming decades. So little fun fact, as a club last year, what we did was we went to ETH Denver, which is the world's largest Ethereum conference. It's held in Denver every March, February, just depends on like the logistical hurdles that the developers have to overcome. But great conference, highly recommended every single year. It's free to attend, but we attended ETH Denver last year, ETH Denver this year, and then Bitcoin Miami as part of like a networking effort to form additional club connections and sponsorships for last year's hackathon. And we met with the founders of POAP. So essentially what a POAP is, and I think this is one of the coolest use cases for NFTs within an educational context, is understanding a POAP is essentially like a proof of attendance protocol, okay? So essentially like NFTs are non-fungible tokens, like in terms of like the objective definition. And like, you know, when you're talking about like fungibility of a token, like Ethereum, like typical cryptocurrencies are fungible in nature in that I can exchange one Ether from one individual, move it to another individual, and there's no loss in value in that transfer because one Ether is one Ether, regardless of what wallet or public key it's associated with. Whereas with a POAP in an NFT, there's fungibility concerns. I mean, there's non-fungible in that I could transfer one NFT from one individual, move it to another, and there could be a theoretical loss in value in that exchange because maybe one NFT possesses greater utility or alternative characteristics relative to other ones that are existing on the blockchain. So anyway, the idea that we really focused on at Bitcoin Miami was the idea of using POAPs as an attendance-based university system. So a POAP stands for a proof of attendance protocol. So the idea, it's essentially an NFT that is mintable upon interaction with a physical event. So in theory, we could have done it for today. Essentially like have a QR code essentially right by the door. Individuals are essentially able to connect their public key, their wallet, their Ethereum address, and it meant a POAP essentially verifies that they were at this event. So the great thing about POAP is that it's enabled this new peer-to-peer form of social media platforms in the form of essentially like if I have individual A, and let's say I went to a Broncos game, I went to a University of Denver blockchain symposium, I went to an Avalanche game, and then I have another individual here that's collected a POAP from the Minnesota Wild, a Vikings game, and let's say they went to a blockchain symposium at the UNM. Essentially, they can find common characteristics between those POAPs in that, okay, may not be a Broncos fan, that's okay. We're not all Broncos fans. And then they're a Vikings fan, but the commonality between those two characteristics is the NFL. And then same thing with the NHL. Okay, we have the Wild here, we have the Avalanche here. The commonality is the NHL. And same thing here, different universities, but the same interest in blockchain topics. And the idea is that through a POAP-based social media platform, we're able to connect individuals based on verified experiences that they've actually engaged with, rather than being catfished left, right, and center on Tinder. So no more catfishing, no more Manti Teo. So anyway, guys, going a little bit further here, in terms of understanding the actual use cases for POAPs in an academic setting, the first thing that we conceptually came up with was the idea of a POAP-based attendance system for universities. And I'm going to touch on this for a second for some of you guys who haven't been, in college for the last 15 years, and that's fine. We don't talk about that. So going a bit further here, I wanted actually, I'm going to flip back and then go back here. Okay. Does anyone know what this is? What I'm showing. Professors, anything? Clicker, yeah, 100%. So anyone that's been in a lecture-based academic setting understands that it is extremely unfeasible for a professor teaching 200 individual students to like accurately take attendance on a lecture hall, because of the fact that I'm going in, everyone comes in, okay, click A if you're here in the class, great, and you look in the audience, there's 40 people there, and there's 200 responses associated with people sitting in class. I'm like, that, math isn't mathing right now. So the idea is that essentially, like, I'm victim of this. I can say this freshman year. But essentially, the whole idea is that through a POAP-based attendance system, you're able to essentially tie attendance for each student without compromising on their underlying identity to the number of POAPs that they've collected in an individual class. So essentially, POAPs are limited based on the number of POAPs that can be essentially minted per address. So from a university perspective, you could associate my student ID, like my 873 number or my personal identity, to this hash value. Okay, and obviously from an on-chain perspective, if you just see that hash value, there's no way to correlate that to my physical identity because there's no identifying features that are presented. So the idea is that essentially the professor on their perspective could see individual IDs that are associated with each student and the hash values that correlate to that student ID, and then see how many POAPs are minted associated with that public key. So for example, at DU, we have 2 classes every week. It's the bi-weekly quarter structure. So if we had 1 NFT that was minted per class in a given quarter, in theory, if you had 100% attendance, you should have 20 POAPs minted by the end of the year or the end of the quarter. And essentially what the teacher could do is essentially he would see a ledger associating every student ID with the hash value and how many POAPs have been minted with that correlated NFT. And essentially determine a final legitimate attendance value without dealing with multiple responses associated with saying you're in the building, but you're not actually in the building. So a really cool use case for you guys. Sorry, but this just got moved the timer around my slide. So one thing that's really important to understand here, guys, is going back to what Professor Coleman and what Professor Charles were talking about is ownership of your own data. In existing Web2 protocols such as Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, obviously, these existing big tech giants maintain complete ownership of your data, and that's one of the ways that they monetize and they generate revenue as platforms, obviously through the exchange of personal data of individuals. So the whole idea is that by enabling these Web3 platforms and enabling individuals and students to take back their own ownership of their own data, we're essentially able to provide a student-centric experience by students being able to control their data on any arbitrary circumstance that they interact with on a university level. So one thing that's really interesting to understand is, and a really big challenge in terms of implementing blockchain within academia, is establishing a universal standard in education credential verification. So, they talk about interoperability between one educational institution to another and, creating a universal standard in terms of if we are to create these decentralized, research DAOs that essentially are channeling funds into these research projects through like a non-discriminatory manner, like what are the avenues and rules that are created to govern these potential systems that haven't been created in theory. So one thing that's really important to note is that also we view, or I mean, personally, again, I'm not reflecting the university's view, is that essentially the future university experience on-chain is going to be through essentially like an on-chain profile that is updated through engagements and experiences that an individual student will engage with throughout their university experience. So for example, you would come into the University of Denver, have your 87 number, and essentially have an additional identifying factor such as that hash that is tied to your individual student ID. And as you engage throughout your university experience, you're able to go to different field trips and attend different conferences and attend just different events throughout the city and essentially form a profile through your GPA, the activities that you engage with on campus, as well as being able to verify your academic credentials on chain. So that way, when you guys go to transition out of the University of Denver and move into a professional setting, essentially you're able to verify your GPA, your underlying academic and professional credentials without having to essentially lie. And essentially it'll help both the employers in terms of vetting their individual, the talent within the university context, as well as it'll help university students in terms of projecting and legitimately verifying their university credentials when they go to apply outside of a university context. So going a little bit further here, one thing I really want to talk about is the mass adoption of blockchain technologies in academia in relation to artificial intelligence and chat boxes such as ChatGPT. So one common misconception associated with the mass adoption of particular technology is the chasm. So obviously right here, in terms of like the context of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, I believe we're kind of right about here from a regulatory in terms of like a mass adoption perspective. You have the weirdos in their basement that are mining Bitcoin back in 2010, 2009, reading the white paper. Then we have everyone here that cares enough to be here. We have the chasm, and then we have early majority, late majority, and laggards. And the thing social media is understanding we're right around here in terms of the adoption curve. Now, the one thing that's really interesting to talk about, and I never actually really considered this implication until a few weeks ago, is understanding, you keep hearing about this terminology in Web3 of like, how do we onboard the next billion individuals? How do we onboard the mass adoption, these potential global use cases of blockchain to where we're not having to explain to people like the underlying utility of blockchains. They just fundamentally understand it. Same thing with a car. Like people don't understand how an engine or like the technical functionality of a car, but they just know that I'm going from point A to point B in a far more efficient manner than if I'm walking. And that's really fundamentally, that's all you need to know. So one thing we need to talk about is the fact that when you talk about like ChatGPT and like AI applications, there is no terminology in use of the word of like onboarding a billion users because it's automatically intuitive. You understand the inherent value of ChatGPT, the ability to synthesize information rather than just being recommended the most relevant articles, taking these articles and generating the most relevant information. People don't need to be sold on the idea of more efficiently, synthesizing information. Whereas I think with blockchain and Web3, you're having to kind of poke people a little bit more in terms of like having to understand the value and understanding the utility. And essentially you have all these outside noise from FTX, centralized exchanges, Gemini, that are all failing last year. And that essentially contributes, it detracts from the underlying focus and utility that's being presented from the technology. So really important to note. One thing that's really important to note is that as we cross this chasm, I truly believe that there's going to be 4 factors that allow us to achieve mainstream adoption, institutional adoption of Web3 protocols. And it comes in the form of 4 different catalysts that I think could occur in the next 2 to 3 years. The first one being regulatory and legal frameworks. You've seen the Biden administration recently in the last 2-3 weeks taken, they've issued a Wells notice to Coinbase. The SEC is suing, the CFTC is suing Binance for offering an illegal derivatives exchange in the United States. And so essentially there's no regulatory clarity in terms of like what is defining a cryptocurrency as a security, what is defining a cryptocurrency as a blockchain, defining a security as a commodity. Regardless of who you speak in the CFTC or the SEC, there's no clarity in that manner. So essentially, one thing is going to be having regulatory and legal framework regarding the trade and use of blockchains and cryptocurrencies within institutional settings, education and awareness, and this is touching back on what Professor Coleman and Professor Charles were saying regarding that you have this huge chasm of understanding of the subject matter in that you have these developers that are creating these exceptionally beneficial Web3 protocols, but having a user base that has no idea how to interact with it on a day-to-day basis. So you need to close the education chasm and essentially scalability and performance. I know we haven't touched on that a lot, but one of the biggest issues of blockchain protocols is the scalability in that when you see a bull run and everyone starts to use the Ethereum blockchain or use the Bitcoin blockchain, transaction fees skyrocket proportionately. And essentially, you think of all the transactions that are included in a block or in a block in a blockchain. Think of it as it's a public good in a sense, but as block space, as more individuals and more entities compete for that finite amount of block space, inherently individuals are going to be priced out of the market just due to transaction fees. So it's how do we, if we want this to be a truly global technology that experiences mass adoption, how are we going to ensure that individuals aren't priced out of the market? Could you imagine going as an individual, let's say we take a bankless individual, as Professor Charles was saying, in Africa, and you go to engage in a transaction sending stable coins from point A to point B, and you're unable to do so because the transaction fees are so high. The idea is that understanding how we solve the scalability dilemma on-chain or off-chain over the next 5 years could be key in terms of instituting and engaging this institutional adoption. And then the last thing, and I think this is the most important thing in terms of understanding mainstream adoption within an institutional university setting, is solving the Web3 UI UX dilemma. It sucks. It's terrible. Essentially, at the end of the day, the big thing that we need to focus on from Web3 perspective is just technological efficiencies. In that, take all the noise, take all the articles, take everything out of it, and out at the end of the day, essentially, I'm able to move value from point A to point B with a far greater underlying transaction validity. I don't compromise on my identity and don't have to reveal it in the transaction process. And essentially, you're moving it from point A to point B without essentially removing the middleman of the transaction fees associated in transferring that value. So the one thing we really need to understand here is that essentially, as Professor Charles said, you had the Web 2, Web 1, and you have Web 3 logins. So that whole idea is that the UI UX for Web 3 currently is very fragmented, and individuals really aren't frankly willing to assume all this additional knowledge base that they have to understand to save, let's say, $5, $6 in transaction fees. It's just the amount of knowledge that they have to know relative to the immediate financial benefits aren't worth there at the time being. So one thing that's really important to note here is this right here is the #1 cryptocurrency wallet on Ethereum. Again, it's a multi-chain wallet. It's called MetaMask. So essentially, the way your gateway into Web3 is by interacting with your individual public key into smart contract or decentralized applications. So the most common way that individuals will do that is through MetaMask as an avenue. There's other wallets that are offered, such as Phantom, Hypnosis Safe, other multi-sig wallets, but just for the purpose of how you interact with Web3 protocols, it's through your Ethereum wallet. And one thing that's really important to note here is obviously, like we said, with Web 1, essentially individuals were essentially able to access information through read-only formats without being able to write, post, or interact with the internet in a content creator perspective. And then Web 2, you're essentially able to use your existing Web 2 identity from giants such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, and other existing Web 2 giants to help connect to a swath of centralized applications controlled by big tech companies. And the idea is that now with the Web3 protocols, your ID and your way to interact with these different protocols on a decentralized basis is through your wallet and through your public key. So going a little bit further here, guys, one thing that we need to talk about is advancing knowledge and protecting the efficient data research exchanges that are going to arise as a result of Web3 technologies. Talking a little bit further, I think one thing that's really important to understand is that I think everyone is using, like in a startup sense, using AI and blockchains as like buzzwords to generate revenue for their idea, but not every Web3 idea needs to be built on a blockchain, and not every decentralized education protocol in the future needs to be built directly on chain as well. So theoretically, there's multiple different solutions and multiple different avenues that there's multiple different avenues that individual students or universities can pursue in terms of achieving this decentralized education network that we could, in theory, see in the next 5-10 years. One thing that's really important to note is they believe on an institutional level that blockchains can help streamline the peer review processes through new peer-to-peer global collaboration networks, such as having secular education DAOs in one country or one university or one region connecting to one another and not having to deal with the intermediate peer review process. So one thing that's going to expand on that is also the incentivization of open access and data sharing protocols through university collaborations. So the idea is that obviously you have secular funding networks that are dependent on like national economic conditions. So obviously, the funding efforts for a research project for a university student in, let's say, the UK right now, where they're at 40-year high inflation, I think it's a 10% rate last month. Their ability to receive funding for their individual research project would have a drastically less probability versus a university student in Denver, just due to the economic variability between the two countries right now. The idea is that by taking these national and international barriers and decreasing them through these educational DAOs, we are able to democratize the access to these resources and funding protocols in the future. So one thing that's really important to note is ending the non-discriminatory funding practices in academic research development. So, I mean, I was been saying this earlier, is that in the past, you typically have to associate a research project or funding proposal with a group of students or physical identities, whereas through decentralized research DAOs and protocols, you're essentially able to submit a project and evaluate its feasibility based on a hash that's tied to the project's underlying identifying features, and not reveal the underlying sponsors of the work. So going a bit further here, I have 4 individual recommendations for improving the Web3 student experience in the future going forward. And the first thing is going to be simplified onboarding and Web2 integration. So You've seen some failed efforts in the last 3 to 4 months regarding Instagram and Meta's efforts in integrating NFTs onto their platform, whether it's through a profile picture or a Twitter Blue subscription. You pay $8 a month, and you're essentially able to verify your profile picture on chain through a token ID. So I think one thing that's gonna be really big here is creating some sort of mass adoption use case for blockchain technology, whether it's through an education DAO, whether it's the mass adoption of stable coins, tokenization of illiquid assets. I mean, it could be blockchain gaming in the next 3-4 years in terms of tokenization of like in-game tokens and artifacts that you're able to collect. There will just need to be some sort of simplified onboarding process, because at the end of the day, people don't have enough time to care about the intricacies of like maintaining private key security and learning how to integrate themselves within these Web3 contexts. So essentially, we need to focus on the simplified onboarding of Web2 integrations and give users avenues that can provide account creation, wallet setup, key management, with the key expectations of concepts, just public keys, private keys, and the educational resources needed to fully understand how to interact with these protocols. And then two, the second thing is user-friendly interfaces. I mean, I don't need to get talking about public key, private key cryptography, but essentially, I don't know if you guys knew this, but if you lose the private key associated with your public key, game over, turn the lights off, carry me home. Yeah, it's not bad. You don't want to lose your private key. Essentially, that's kind of your social security number in the context of Web3. So creating some sort of user-friendly interface, whether it's in the form of easy private key storage, in the form of government regulation that protects users in the event that they lose their private key and they lose their cryptocurrency assets that could be held in stable coins. So really just focusing on designing intuitive and visually appealing applications that make it easy for individuals to interact with on a day-to-day basis, so they're able to take advantage of the technological efficiencies of blockchain without having to subject themselves to like a Web2 experience. So going a little bit further, another thing is contextual education. I think the best platform at the moment in terms of educating their user base is, I mean, I hate centralized exchanges. I don't want to talk about FTX right now, but Coinbase. Essentially what they do is they do a really good job of onboarding their users by forcing them to understand the Web3 protocols and cryptocurrencies that they invest in by having different quizzes that offer like arbitrary small amounts of cryptocurrencies, whether it's like $4 of Ether or $4 of Solana or $5 of Polygon, to fully understand the conceptuality and the benefit of the platform and how they can potentially interact with it. So that's another big thing. And then additionally, I would say advocating on a local legislative level. Governor Jared Polis, not to get political with anyone here in the room, he's very pro-blockchain in terms of the integration of blockchain within the My Colorado application, driver's license, and then essentially they also talked about, because we had him come here to speak last year, was regarding on-chain governance for Colorado voting. If we have future legislative efforts between our congressmen, our congresswomen on a state level, we're essentially able to verify generations in the future what our legislators in the past had verified and voted on. So greater transparency in the voting process. I think it's a huge thing with, you know, all the questions in the United States these days about election integrity and, you know, centralization of these voting machines and control of these, you know, voting companies. Democratizing the voting process and on-chain governance so people can see how we interact with it. And then the last thing is improving the transaction experience. So not many people understand the variable rate structure associated with the Ethereum blockchain, in that one day I could get up at 4 in the morning and I could send 100 million USDC from point A to point B and pay a 50 cent a transaction fee. And the next day I could send that same store value, $100 million from point A to point B, and pay, let's say, $500–600 in transaction fees. So the whole idea is understanding the variable rate fee structure and making it so essentially, even if the network is theoretically functioning, it is always accessible from a transaction cost perspective for any user. So what's next? I mean, it's a lot of stuff to throw at you guys. One thing that's really important to note is that it's really difficult to project Web3 developments in terms of, you know, if you would have talked to people 5 years ago, what would be the top 10 cryptocurrencies by market cap in 2023, 2024, no one would have an idea. Like, people wouldn't even get 50% of it right in terms of understanding potential use cases and trends in Web3. So it's very difficult to project. It's kind of like the internet in late 1990s, early 2000s, in that it's just kind of the West, where there's just a bunch of these undefined protocols, individuals with a lot of ambition and promise in the area, but there's really no like final product that is really marketable to a group of consumers. So that's one thing that's really important to note. Second thing is obviously going to be regulatory reform. I would be surprised if we go into the next re-election cycle without having some sort of clarity on a regulation standpoint regarding the security status of individual cryptocurrencies within the Ethereum, just within Web3 as a whole. And then three, and this is going to be key for onboarding, is obviously improving the Web3 UI UX experience to ensure that university students can have a seamless, safe, and fruitful experience interacting with Web3 protocols while taking advantage of the technological efficiencies. And then just simple use cases in academia. I don't think you're going to go from no blockchain integration within a university context to everything being run by DAOs and on-chain governance within a university context. So just simple use cases that could start the adoption of Web3 blockchain protocols within Web3, such as, like I said, diploma issuance. So Peter White, who was our VP at the Web3 Club last year, he went to a community college before he transferred to the University of Denver. And they essentially had a dual degree issuance through the community college where he was issued a virtual diploma via the Ethereum blockchain that he could present the token to employers as like a verifiable credential, and then also received the physical diploma that he could hang on his wall and take a picture with. So that's one thing that's really important to note there is just understanding those potential use cases like diploma issuance, grade verification, attendance protocols, like I showed you there, that conceptual idea that we made of having a POAP-based attendance system that is used for large-scale university colleges, and then tokenization of academic achievement. So essentially, you could have your ID or your hash associated with the student ID, and then when they graduate cum laude, they can essentially have that accreditation tied to that public key and verify, oh, I graduated cum laude? No, you didn't. It's like you didn't have the grades to do it. So essentially, we're able to, I think it really helps from an employer perspective in that you're not having students lie or exacerbate their education credentials to get a job. And, understanding that a lot of these employers don't do the back end checks to understand, okay, did they actually get a 3.5? Did they actually get a 3.7? Did they actually get a 4.0? Or are they just saying it to get past the initial screening process so that way they can get in the end and get her seat? So it helps both employers in vetting qualified, verified talent, as well as helping students bypass unqualified individuals that could theoretically take their future job opportunities. And then medium term, I think, in terms of like blockchain developments in academia, you're going to be seeing robust decentralized learning platforms. I don't think it's necessarily going to be only in a university context. It could be for other applications, such as you have a decentralized platform that teaches individuals how to interact with Web3. So it's a group of individuals that create Web3 lessons and videos that individuals can learn from, and essentially based on the revenue that's generated by interacting with those videos, the revenue can be democratized amongst the creators in a way that Professor Coleman was stating earlier. And then additionally, you have like decentralized research funding platforms that I think will arise, and then cross-institutional collaborations on chain that will improve resource allocation between funding proposals and the end research ambitions that are achieved by universities. So thank you all for the discussion today, and I really appreciate it. Have a good one.